Welcome to On the Moneyline, a podcast by MMA Play 365. I'm Newsome, and I'm here to give you this weekend's breakdowns and predictions from the stacked pay-per-view, which is UFC 276. We've got two title fights as well, so that's going to be a phenomenal card. Just before we get into the breakdowns, though, as always, there's going to be a Baze AI from the UFC prediction software by MMA Play 365, a recap video on our YouTube channel in the Baze AI specific playlist. Last weekend, it was 67% overall, which is still very solid. It's flying now, the AI, but also make sure you check that out because the highest ever percentage prediction was with an underdog last week at 83.55%, and that underdog won as well. So we'll be breaking that down. Make sure you don't miss that. Tune in over on the MMA Play 365 YouTube channel. But now, the moment we've been waiting for, the reason why you're all here and you're waiting and listening, UFC 276, and we start in the main event for the UFC Middleweight Championship. We've got Israel Adesanya versus Jared Cannonier. And this is, for me, unfortunately, like I say, I always hate to break fights down in this way, especially title fights as well, but that just goes to show, you know, how dominant and how good Israel Adesanya is as a middleweight champion. But I do think this is going to be a relatively one-sided fight. The one thing that Israel Adesanya does have to be careful of naturally is that power and the aggression coming from Cannonier, because if Cannonier does land on anybody in the division, he's got the power to knock them out cold. He's just got that raw athleticism and that raw power. So Adesanya's got to be careful, but it's not as if Adesanya's never fought a big power striker before. Adesanya's an elite level striker. His speed, his movement, his elusiveness, the ability to not only recognize danger, but pick his angles and just make reads on in the fights to make the fights look relatively comfortable for him, even though, you know, I'm sure it's not comfortable just to the eye. You know, from the outside looking in, it makes it look comfortable just because of how good he is. And I just think he's going to be too much for someone like Jared Cannonier. I don't think Jared Cannonier can wrestle him. If he does, then I think Adesanya's jiu-jitsu is more than good enough to be able to get back up to the feet. He's been tested multiple times in that respect as well. But I don't think the fight's going to be won and lost on the mat in the wrestling or the grappling department. I think the fight's going to be won and lost in the striking and what happens on the feet. And Israel Adesanya, for me, is just way too good. Like I said, he's going to be quicker. He's going to be faster. He's going to be landing more volume. Even if Jared Cannonier is moving forwards, being aggressive, Adesanya will back up. He can fight just as good on the back foot as he can on the front foot. And like I said, he'll be able to exit out of the cage. Remember, we're in the big cage here, UFC 276, with it being a pay-per-view card. So we're in the big cage. Plenty of room for Israel Adesanya to work here. And I think he's just going to put on another phenomenal performance. I'm not sure if he finishes Cannonier, but I just cannot see Cannonier's hand being raised at the end of the night. So I'm picking Israel Adesanya to win the fight and still the UFC middleweight champion. And in the co-main event, our second title fight of the night. And this is actually a trilogy fight at this point, which, to be honest with you, I'm not surprised. For the featherweight, UFC featherweight championship, we've got Alexander Volkanovski versus Max Holloway 3. And the featherweight division is just a really odd division. I was only talking to a friend about it the other day. Like, you've got Alexander Volkanovski at the top of the pack that seems to be borderline untouchable right now. You know, you can't beat him. And even Max Holloway's tried twice, and admittedly that second fight was very close and probably could have gone either way. But still, Alexander Volkanovski's most off performance, if you want to call it that. Again, no disrespect to Max Holloway, but Volkanovski didn't look on it in that second fight as he did in the first fight and in previous fights. So for Volkanovski to have a little bit of a lackluster performance and still come out on top just tells you exactly where he is in the division. But then you've got Max Holloway behind him, the rightful contender, the rightful number one contender. And Max Holloway is just so far away from everybody else below him as well. So this is what's crazy about the division. You've got a pack of fighters in the rankings, but then you've got Holloway that's a million miles ahead of everybody else behind him. And then you've got Volkanovski that's quite far ahead of Max Holloway, and I feel like we might even see this a fourth time as well, you know, at some point in the future. But back to this fight specifically, I think I think you can guess sort of where I'm going with it. I think Volkanovski is going to have too much for Max Holloway again. The one thing that I do like from Max Holloway is his takedown defense is borderline elite, and if you do take him down, he's going to be able to get back up as well. But That sort of stifles one aspect of Volkanovski's game, but Volkanovski is such an underrated striker as well. Really calm, really crisp, really precise, picks his shots, slides in and out of range really well, and he's just really difficult to deal with. Speed, movement, and again, the angles. Now, Holloway's always going to give himself a chance in this fight, and he's always going to win at least 1 or 2 rounds in this fight. It's can he win that 3rd round, the 3 rounds that he needs out of the 5 to be able to take this fight from Volkanovski and become once again a UFC champion. And I'm just not sure he can, because Volkanovski can go through the gears as well. And Volkanovski's fight IQ, he's a really intelligent fighter, and that helps him in these sort of fights, because if Holloway was sort of 1 or 2 rounds up and only needed 1 more round to steal the fight, Volkanovski's going to know that. He's going to fight smart. He'll make the in-cage adjustments. And I think from a style versus style perspective, they're both really talented fighters. They're both great strikers. There's not a huge edge in the striking. The wrestling, the grappling, like I say, I don't think that's going to be predominant in this fight at all. But where the edge is for me is that intelligence and that speed and the movement coming from Alexander Volkanovski. And I think that's going to be the difference once again in this fight. I think Volkanovski is going to defend his belt successfully. I'm picking Alexander Volkanovski to win this fight and still the UFC featherweight champion. And in the next fight, this should be a fun one. We've got Sean Strickland versus Alex Pereira. And like I say, it's going to be another striking fight. I think Alex Pereira, with that kickboxing background, although he has been training with Glover Teixeira for a while now, so that wrestling and that grappling for sure is going to be developing, I think it's safe to say. And we have seen moments of it as well where, you know, a typical predominantly kickboxing heavy fighter would get stuck on his back and not be able to get back up to the feet. But we have seen Pereira in those situations, and he does look okay. Obviously, if he came against a really strong wrestler or grappler, then I think that's where he would come really, really stuck. But here against Sean Strickland, I do see Strickland potentially looking for some takedowns in this fight. Strickland against Uriah Hall's an interesting fight to watch, because Hall's a talented kickboxer as well. He's fast, he's elusive, he's explosive, and he's got power. And actually, even though Alex Pereira is a more skilled, from a technical perspective, kickboxer than Uriah Hall, I do think Uriah Hall is faster and has more volume and has that explosivity in MMA, things that Alex Pereira doesn't have. So although Sean Strickland's going to be dealing with a more technical fighter here, I actually think Sean Strickland's dealt with a better overall MMA kickboxer inside the cage in Uriah Hall, and he absolutely smashed Uriah Hall and also completed multiple takedowns as well and had some decent top control time. And I think that if Strickland replicates that performance against Alex Pereira as he did against Uriah Hall, I think he's going to be able to win this fight. Alex Pereira, he's got the power, he's got that sharp striking. And actually, just like what we saw last week against Carlos Ulberg, like I said on that podcast, that breakdown last week, Ulberg has that sneaky power where the straight shots just generate some power behind them. So I do believe Alex Pereira's in that same boat. I think that Sean Strickland has definitely got to be mindful of the power coming back at him. But Sean Strickland's durable. He can take strikes. He loves getting hit. You know, he's that type of fighter that goes really hard in training. So I think when you're mixing everything together, Sean Strickland, again, with the volume, this is a fighter that has landed over 600 strikes in his last 5 fights alone. And he's a consistent 100 plus strikes per fighter as well. So I think it's going to be that type of fight again where he's going to be able to be putting up high numbers. I think Alex Pereira is going to start falling behind in the rounds because of that volume, because that Sean Strickland's just picking away at him. But I do think Alex Pereira's live throughout the fight for a knockout. Outside of that, if he doesn't knock Strickland out, I really do struggle seeing how Alex Pereira wins this fight. And for that reason, I am going to be siding with Sean Strickland. I'm picking Sean Strickland to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got an interesting one here. We've got Pedro Munhoz versus Sean O'Malley. And the interesting thing with this fight is Sean O'Malley's finally getting a big step up in competition, in my opinion. I know he's fought Marlon Vera, but since that fight, since that loss, he's now stepping into that territory again where he's fighting one of the better fighters in the division, someone that is closer to the top than outside of the rankings. So with Pedro Munhoz, I think that if this fight is taking place at range, if the majority of the fight we've got Sean O'Malley dictating the pace, dictating the distance, I think Sean O'Malley is going to absolutely piece Pedro Munhoz up and pick him apart. However, with that being said, although Sean O'Malley's going to have the height, the range, the speed, in my opinion, even the movement as well, I think that Pedro Munhoz has got one massive weapon here. And I think anybody that knows, and the hardcore fans that listen to this, where I'm about to go with this. I feel like the low calf kicks for Pedro Munhoz could be an absolute game-changing weapon for him here. Sean O'Malley's got long legs, the skinny legs that have been hurt numerous times in the past. He has been dropped with them. And like I said, those legs can be got out. The stance that Sean O'Malley takes up, leaving that long leg out there, he's just asking to be kicked. And Pedro Munhoz has won multiple fights, in my opinion, from just damaging that lead leg of his opponent enough to be able to immobilize him a little bit and then take over the fight himself. And I think that weapon's absolutely going to be here for him. And it's almost like a knockout shot for a heavyweight fighter, someone like Francis Ngannou. The fact that Pedro Munhoz has got this in his back pocket. Now, some fighters check leg kicks really well, or deal with leg kicks really well, low calf kicks really well. Like Jose Aldo, he showed when he fought Pedro Munhoz that he was very equipped for those low kicks. Same with Dominic Cruz last time out as well. But I think someone like Sean O'Malley, I think that leg is going to be kicked and kicked and kicked. And although, like I say, I think O'Malley's got all the physical attributes to win this fight, like I said, the length, the height, the reach, the distance management, the speed as well, also racking up volume within that speed, I cannot ignore that low calf kick from Pedro Munhoz, which is actually making me slightly side with the underdog in this fight. So I am going to be picking Pedro Munhoz to win this fight. And in the next fight, this is a really, really good fight as well. We've got Brad Riddell versus Jalin Turner. And I'm a big fan of Jalin Turner. I think that this is a fighter that is not only looking better each time out, but the rapid developments that he's making from fight to fight is insane right now. A guy that's tall and long and rangy, he's finally finding his volume, he's finding his power, he's finding his technical ability on the feet, but he's also a brown belt in BJJ. He's got decent wrestling. He's got submissions on his record now as well. He's really putting it together and he's looking like a really complete fighter in the division. And he's got a rightful step up here against Brad Riddell. Brad Riddell coming off that loss against Rafael Fiziev. But Brad Riddell's fought some phenomenal fighters as well. Drew Dober in there. So this is a real test for Jalin Turner and a real step up in competition, but one that he definitely deserves. Now, Brad Riddell's not going to make things easy for Jalin Turner at all. Brad Riddell is a phenomenal kickboxer himself, lifetime of kickboxing experience. So coming at Jalin Turner's got to be prepared for a very tough fight here, and a fight that he's not going to have everything his own way on the feet, which is what he's been accustomed to and used to over the last couple of fights. Brad Riddell's definitely going to come at him. He's going to try and constantly enter inside the pocket, inside that boxing range, to land strikes on Jalin Turner. But honestly, even though, by the way, spoiler alert, I am picking Jalin Turner to win this fight, I'm a little bit surprised that he's not an underdog. He opened at around -175. It's closed a little bit, shortened up, and it's not far from a pick 'em, but Jalin Turner is still a very slight favourite. I am surprised it's the other way, even though I am picking him to win. And I think that Jalin Turner is going to do exactly that. I think he's going to find his range in this fight. He's definitely going to have moments where he's having to be defensive and he's having to potentially weather an early storm from Brad Riddell. But I think once Jalin Turner finds his range, again, the big cage is going to really help him here. I think Jalin Turner is going to be able to start putting strikes together at range, coming in with his own choice, deciding when to come in, decided when to slide back out of range. And if the fight hits the mat, I actually think Jalin Turner, with his length and how tall he is, could be a problem for Brad Riddell on the mat as well. So with everything put together, I think it's a big test for Jalin Turner. I think it's the biggest fight of his career. It's going to be definitely be the toughest fight he's ever had for sure. But I am picking Jalin Turner to win this fight. And then the next fight, a fight of the veterans. We've got Robbie Lawler versus Bryan Barberena, and this has just got slugfest written all over it. I think that both fighters at this point just are going to be going in there to brawl. Robbie Lawler doesn't want to be fighting anybody like he did against Magny, for example, that he's just trying to take him down, the same as Colby Covington. And Bryan Barberena, a little bit of the same. I think both of these fighters have signed on the dotted line here on that bout agreement to go in there knowing that their opponent's just going to want to slug at them and they want to slug back at them. I think it's going to be that type of fight. And that's ultimately why it's going to be close. Now, initially you would be thinking, looking at the name value, why is Robbie Lawler only a -130 favourite, at least at the time of recording? But it's going to be a close fight because both fighters are going to be slugging at each other. The judges are going to probably find it quite difficult to score because there's going to be a lot of action, a lot going on in the close quarters. Both fighters are probably going to get stunned and rocked, and it's going to be back and forth, and that always makes for quite a close fight. But I do think that in those sort of fights, the veteran, the one that's been around for all those years, a future champion and someone that has that high level of fight IQ is the more likely fighter to really pull ahead and edge the rounds in this type of potential slugfest fight. So for that reason, I have to side with the more veteran fighter here in Robbie Lawler to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Garry versus Gabe Green. Now, pre-tape, before I watched film on this, I thought that Garry is, he's just going to be able to pick Gabe Green apart. Like, I like Gabe Green as a fighter. He's a good, well-rounded fighter, but I thought Garry, with how sharp he is and precise he is just going to be able to have his way here. Now, after watching the tape, I completely agree with that side of Garry. The kid is sharp, he's fast, he's striking, he's developing. He's training out at Sanford MMA, so he's getting good coaching. He's going to be developing, improving from fight to fight. He's young. So Garry is that really precise fighter. And again, he's got that deceptive power that's just generated from the straight shots. But actually, from Gabe Green's perspective, I think that Gabe Green can cause some problems for Garry here. I really do, because Gabe Green's pressure is insane, and he's going to take a couple of shots coming in, and that's always the concern against somebody like Garry that does have good movement as well, by the way. The straight shots coming in as Gabe Green's trying to close this distance, and Garry's just going to try and angle and exit out of the side and back into the center of the octagon. But Gabe Green, like I said, his pressure's really good here. He closes the distance really well. He's got power, he's got wrestling, he's got good jiu-jitsu as well. And he's a workhorse, so he'll constantly be in the face of your opponent, and he'll constantly be putting out as much volume as he can. Now, I think that Garry is going to actually sting and hurt Gabe Green at some point in this fight, maybe multiple times. But the fact that Gabe Green's got this crazy pressure and the ability to close the distance really quickly is something that Garry has definitely got to be wary and careful of in this fight, because it could end up being one of those fights if Garry's on the back foot for the entire fight and Gabe Green's being aggressive and pressing forwards and looking to land and wing the big shots, looking for the fight ending intentions. The judges might end up favouring Gabe Green, again, should it go to the scorecards. I do think Garry's got the finishing upside. I think he's more likely to finish Gabe Green than the other way around, but if this goes to a decision, it could be relatively close. However, I am still going to side with the speed and the precision striking from Garry, and also the good movement as well with the exiting and the angles against the cage on the back foot. So for those reasons, I'm picking Garry to win this fight. And now we're going back to the veterans in the next fight. We've got Donald Cerrone versus Jim Miller. The UFC clearly didn't want to keep rebooking Cerrone versus Lawson. That fight's supposed to have happened twice. I picked both times in both breakdowns for Donald Cerrone to win that fight against Joe Lawson. I thought it was a good fight for him. But here against Jim Miller, I think it's an absolute terrible fight for him. I think that Jim Miller, at this stage in the career, because you've got to analyse them where they are right now, not where they were, 5-10 years ago, because both of these fighters have been fighting in the UFC for such a long time. They're both staples and potential future Hall of Famers as well. But where they are right now, I think that Jim Miller's actually on a little bit of a resurgence. I think he's looking sharp. He's looking better than what a lot of people expected at this point in his career. At one point with the Lyme disease and everything, I thought, and myself personally as well, I thought that Jim Miller was potentially on his way out. But man, the resurgence that this guy's had is crazy. And his striking's looking sharp. He's putting everything together. Obviously, his ground game is always going to be there as well. And this is where I think it's going to be difficult for Cerrone, because Cerrone, he's now done like 2 weight cuts in the last, month. I think, just off the top of my head, but obviously a weight cut a couple of weeks ago as well. And I feel that he's going to now go through another weight cut with this fight with Jim Miller. Jim Miller's going to be fresher. He's going to be the more active fighter, I think. From a striking perspective, I think he's going to throw the cleaner, crisper strikes. I think he's just going to do the better body of work inside of boxing range, which is where I feel that both fighters are going to do the best work here. But then with the wrestling, I actually think Jim Miller's the better wrestler. So if a fight is going to hit the mat, then I do believe it's going to be Jim Miller being on top of Cerrone. And then Jim Miller's jiu-jitsu is really good, and I think it's good enough to keep Cerrone down for extended periods of time. But again, Cerrone's BJJ is good as well, so I don't think he'll get completely rolled on the mat. I think he could find his way back up to his feet, but I think for either fighter, if either fighter was on the back, I think if Jim Miller was on his back, I think Cerrone would have success on top for extended periods of time. It's just, I feel that Jim Miller's going to be the slightly better striker, and if there is a fighter on the back more often than not, I think that's more likely to be Cerrone because Jim Miller's got the better wrestling. So again, putting everything together, I think it's going to be a difficult fight for Cerrone, and then the physical aspects of coming into that, like I said, with the now third weight cut in X amount of weeks, I think it's not going to be great for Cerrone. I think he is going to struggle once he gets inside the cage. I'm picking Jim Miller to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got a massive clash of styles here. We've got Uriah Hall versus Andre Muniz. Andre Muniz is really putting everything together really well right now. He's submitting fighters, he's finishing them, he's exciting, his wrestling's getting better. He is putting it all together really well, and he's looking like, if he does get through Uriah Hall in this fight, then I feel like Andre Muniz, this could be the start of his surge up into the division and really testing himself with the best of the best that the division's got to offer. But he's going to have difficulties, in my opinion, in this fight because although Uriah Hall did get taken down by Sean Strickland in their fight, like I mentioned earlier in the Sean Strickland breakdown, I think that Uriah Hall does generally have good takedown defense. He can be taken down, but if he is taken down, it's normally by a relentless wrestler and a fighter that's got a decent wrestling background as well. Sean Strickland's a really good wrestler, reactively shotting for those body lock takedowns. So I think that Uriah Hall does genuinely have good takedown defense. If Muniz does get him down, though, I think that Hall could be in a bit of trouble. He'd have to spring right back up to his feet before Muniz starts working because Muniz could potentially find a submission finish on the mat. But in the striking department, with the cardio, with the durability as well, the volume, I think all that sits with Uriah Hall. Uriah Hall's got that experience as well of really going and having to dig deep in fights. And I think Uriah Hall's going to be able to put on a good pace from rounds 1 to 3, whereas I can't say the same with Muniz. I think Muniz is going to have a good round 1 in him. And if he does finish this fight, it's more likely to be in round 1. But if we go out of round 1, I think Muniz is going to have been made to work for takedowns. I think Muniz is going to have really rushed to try and get a finish in this fight so he doesn't have to go into a second and third round. And both of those things, I think, are cardio zapping attributes in a fight. And I think Andre Muniz, if he doesn't get that finish in round 1, he's going to struggle rounds 2 and 3, where Uriah Hall has been in this situation before against good grapplers and needing to keep the fight standing, and he's been successful. So I am siding with that experience of Uriah Hall and a fighter that I believe is going to be able to really pull away with this fight in rounds 2 and 3. I never normally like to side with the fighter that's got that round 1 in them, and then there's a lot of question marks after that for rounds 2 and 3, and in a championship fight 4 and 5. So for those reasons, I'm going to be picking Uriah Hall to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Jessica Eye versus Maycee Barber. I think this is an interesting fight. I don't quite agree with the line being so wide with Maycee Barber up at around -240, -250, but I do think that Maycee Barber is rightfully favoured. I think Jessica Eye has sort of hit that pinnacle, and I think she's reached the highest that she's going to reach in the sport, and mentally I think she probably knows that as well. And you see this from a lot of fighters where they go through this resurgence, they climb all the way to the top of the division, they don't quite make it, and then they're coming all the way back down. And, you know, we see that pattern quite a lot, and I think we're going to see that from Jessica Eye. Now, the one thing I will say for Jessica Eye is that she is just a completely game fighter. She'll go in there, she'll scrap, she'll be in the face of her opponent, she'll throw volume, she won't mind getting hit to deliver strikes herself. So she is quite fun from that respect, but that type of game plan against Maycee Barber is probably exactly what Maycee Barber wants. She wants Jessica Eye to come in there recklessly. She wants Jessica Eye to close the distance for her. And she wants Jessica Eye to try and make this fight dirty and ugly, because what that's going to do is give Maycee Barber opportunities to land hard strikes, and not just hard strikes, but combinations as well, and really sting. Jessica Eye is just coming forwards, moving her backwards. It's going to look great for Maycee Barber, you know, from the judges' perspective, if the fight does go for a full 3 rounds. But I think Maycee Barber's got a good stylistic fight ahead of her because of the way Jessica fights. Jessica Eye won't sit on the back foot and sit on the outside and wait for Barber to come in. Jessica Eye will want to, you know, she'll still think she's the best fighter in the division, and she'll want to come forwards and try and prove that. I think that plays straight into Maycee Barber's game, who is very aggressive, very powerful. I think from a wrestling and grappling perspective, I think it's very even on both sides. I don't think there's a huge edge either way. I think it's a fight that's going to have its better moments on the feet. And for that reason, I have to side with Barber. So I'm picking Maycee Barber to win this fight. And in the next fight, this should be a fun one, actually. We've got Brad Tavares versus Dricus du Plessis. Du Plessis had a number of fights booked prior to this, but, you know, they've all fell through, and now he's got Brad Tavares, who it's very difficult unless there is a genuine injury on Tavares' side. I think this fight is actually going to go ahead. I think we are going to see Dricus du Plessis inside the cage. I like Dricus du Plessis. Been watching him from the EFC, the KSW days, the wars with Roberto Soldic, who in my opinion is one of the best fighters in the world. And I like Dricus du Plessis. I think his style's good. He's a very kick-heavy striker, but he's got deceptive power in his hands as well. I would like to see du Plessis let go of his hands more because of the power that he possesses, but he does tend to stick to that kicking heavy style. He's got really wide stance, leans really heavily on his lead leg, and I actually think this is going to be a tool for Brad Tavares. Brad Tavares has got really hard low kicks. He's hurt opponents' legs before with the low kicks, and I think Tavares is going to have opportunities here to blast away at Dricus du Plessis' legs because, like I said, the stance is so wide. He leans so heavy on that lead foot, ready to generate all that power for the right kick coming in at his, well, from du Plessis, coming in at du Plessis' opponents. So I think that that's one weapon for Tavares. The other thing that I think is in Tavares' favour is the technical ability in the boxing. So the kicks are going to be wild from du Plessis. They're going to be hard, and Tavares has definitely got to be careful because he's been knocked out with a head kick before, you know, Edmund Shabazian. But this is the other thing from Tavares. He only really loses against the best fighters in the division. You know, Edmund Shabazian was a prospect at the time, but then he's lost to Israel Adesanya, Robert Whittaker, and you can't put du Plessis in that type of category with your Adesanyas and with your Robert Whittakers. I think Tavares' technical boxing is going to play a part in this fight. I think that Tavares is going to be able to close the distance with the low kicks, immobilise a little bit of what du Plessis is doing if he's got the correct game plan, that is. And then I think Tavares is going to be able to get inside. He's going to be able to land some shots on Dricus du Plessis, some good boxing, technical boxing, put some numbers together. And if this fight does predominantly play out in the boxing range, then Tavares has got to be careful of the power coming from Dricus du Plessis, because I've already said he's got that deceptive power in his hands. But from a technical perspective, I think Tavares is going to get the better of du Plessis inside of boxing range. And du Plessis normally relies on being able to take his opponent down if things aren't going his way as a plan B, and being able to, you know, grapple on top. Du Plessis got really good jiu-jitsu. He's got a good mount pass. He's got really dangerous front chokes as well. So that's something Tavares has got to be careful of. But talking of elite takedown defense, that's Brad Tavares as well. He's very, very, very difficult to take down. Almost, not quite, but almost impossible to take down. And if you do take him down, he'll spring straight back up to his feet. So I kind of think that's one angle and one type of game plan of du Plessis that isn't going to be prominent in this fight. So du Plessis is going to be forced to strike for the majority of the fight. Even if he does want to mix things up, I don't think he's going to be able to. And again, with Brad Tavares, in my opinion, having that low leg kick to kick at, and also being better and the more technical striker in regards to the boxing with the hands and the punches and the combinations, I'm siding very slightly with Brad Tavares here, so I'm picking Brad Tavares to win this fight. And in the final fight of this breakdown of this episode of the podcast, we've got Jessica Rose Clark versus Julija Stoliarenko. And in my opinion, I think it's going to be a relatively close fight, at least early on, but I just trust Jessica Rose Clark just to be able to pull away in this fight now. Stoliarenko's got a good all-round game. Both fighters have actually got a good all-round game. I just think that Clark's the more likely fighter to do better inside of the boxing range. So when both fighters are sliding into range, I just do think that Clark is going to be able to get the better of Stoliarenko. I think she's going to have the slightly faster hands, the slightly better combinations. Then when you get into the wrestling and grappling, I think that's a very slight edge with Jessica Rose Clark as well. So I don't think Jessica Rose Clark is like a million miles ahead of Stoliarenko and way better in every single area, but I do think she's just a little bit better in every single area, and that should be enough to pull Jessica Rose Clark over the line to get the win on the night. So I'm picking Jessica Rose Clark to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of On the Moneyline by MMA Play 365. As always, thank you for subscribing to the channel. Thank you for watching. Thank you for the likes to each video as well. We really do appreciate it. It's myself in the comments. So if you want to tell me who you're predicting to win this weekend and why, and if you've got any bets, you can drop them down there as well, and I'll respond to your bets. And if you are betting on Saturday night, I hope you smash the bookies. I'm Newsome. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again next week.